There is a behavior so common, so reflexive, so deeply wired into how most people move through the world, that they have never once stopped to question whether it is serving them. Every time you are challenged, you explain. Every time you are questioned, you justify. Every time you make a decision that affects someone else, you build the case for it. Carefully, thoroughly, with evidence and context, and the sincere hope that if you explain it well enough, the other person will understand, and understanding will produce acceptance, and acceptance will feel like safety. You have been doing this your entire life, and it has been costing you something you were never told about. Machiavelli watched kings, not the ceremonial kind, the functional kind, the ones who actually held power, who kept it, who navigated courts full of people who wanted what they had. And one of the things he noticed, with the particular clarity of a man who studied behavior rather than ideology, was that the rulers who lasted shared a quality that had nothing to do with intelligence or cruelty or charisma in the obvious sense. They did not explain themselves, not to their advisors, not to their critics, not to the people who questioned their decisions or doubted their judgment, or demanded to know the reasoning behind a choice that affected them. They acted, they decided, and then they moved, without the apology, without the justification, without the careful construction of a case designed to make the decision acceptable to the people it affected. This is not the behavior of the arrogant, though it is often mistaken for arrogance, which is itself an interesting fact about how we read silence in other people. This is the behavior of the certain, of the person who has understood, at a level most people never reach, that explanation is not a neutral act, that it changes things. That every time you offer a justification, something transfers, something you may not have intended to give, to someone who didn't ask for it, but will absolutely use it. Machiavelli called it power. You might call it something else. But by the end of this, you will not call it arrogance. Let's be precise about what happens in the moment of explanation, not what you intend, not what the other person consciously receives, what actually transfers in the space between the decision and the justification of it. At the level of perception, of social dynamics, of the silent, ongoing calculation, every human being is running about every other human being they deal with. When you explain a decision, you are doing several things simultaneously. You are providing information. That's the part you're aware of. The context, the reasoning, the factors you weighed, the conclusion you reached. This is what explanation feels like from the inside. An act of transparency, of respect, of treating the other person as someone intelligent enough to understand your thinking. But you are also doing something else. You are confirming that their understanding is required. That is the transfer Machiavelli was watching, not the content of the explanation, the act of it. Because the act of explaining communicates, below the level of words, a specific piece of information about the power dynamic between you and the person you're explaining to. That their acceptance of your decision is a condition you are working to meet. That you need something from them. That the decision, as it stands, is not yet complete. It requires their comprehension, their agreement, their validation to be fully legitimate. This is what kings understood that most people never do. A decision that requires explanation is a decision that is still, in some sense, on trial. And the person you are explaining it to is, in some sense, the judge. The moment you begin to justify, however sincerely, however reasonably, you have handed them the bench. Machiavelli wrote about the importance of what he called the appearance of decisiveness, not the internal experience of it, but the visible quality of someone who acts without the need for consensus. He observed that people do not primarily follow leaders whose decisions they agree with. They follow leaders whose decisions feel inevitable, whose choices carry the texture of settled fact rather than provisional position. An explanation, almost by definition, makes a decision feel provisional. It opens the decision up for review. It says, "Here is my reasoning. Evaluate it and tell me if it holds." Most people, when they evaluate a decision they've been invited to evaluate, find something to question. Not because the decision is wrong, because that's what evaluation produces. And now the conversation has shifted from the decision itself, which was made, which could have simply been, to the reasoning behind it, which is contestable, which has edges, which the other person can now press. This is the trap that explanation sets for itself. Modern psychology has a name for the phenomenon where providing reasons for a decision actually increases resistance to it, reactance theory. When people feel they are being persuaded, even with genuine information, even with valid logic, something in them resists the persuasion as a function of autonomy preservation. The explanation that was meant to produce acceptance sometimes produces the opposite. Not because the reasoning was poor, because reasoning invited judgment, and judgment produced opposition. The king who does not explain does not trigger reactance. There is nothing to push against. The decision exists. It is the weather, and people confronted with weather do not argue. They adapt. Let's talk about what silence actually does in a social environment. Not the silence of the withdrawn. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, or who is afraid to say it, or who is using silence as punishment. That silence has a texture everyone recognizes, and nobody respects. The silence of the king is something categorically different. It is the silence of someone who has already decided. That distinction between the silence of uncertainty and the silence of settlement is one that observers pick up immediately and almost entirely below conscious awareness. The body carries it. The stillness carries it. The quality of attention carries it. The person who has already decided can afford to listen fully because they are not using the conversation to form their conclusion. They formed it before the conversation began. This is what makes the silence of authority so distinct from the silence of avoidance. And it is what Machiavelli was pointing toward when he wrote about the prince who maintains composure not through emotional suppression, but through the genuine internal state of someone who does not need the room's approval to know what they know. The effect of this silence on the people in the room is measurable and consistent. When a person in authority does not explain, observers do not experience a void. They fill the space with projection, with attributed reasoning that is almost always more sophisticated, more considered, more strategic than whatever the actual explanation would have been. The unexplained decision becomes, in the minds of those observing it, the product of depths they cannot fully see. And depth, even imagined depth, generates deference. This is counterintuitive. We assume that showing our reasoning builds credibility, that transparency earns trust, and in certain contexts, certain relationships, certain phases of trust building, this is true. But in the context of authority, in the dynamics of power and influence, and the ongoing social negotiation of who defers to whom, transparency often operates in reverse. The explained decision reveals the decision-maker as someone who reasons, someone who weighs, someone who can be persuaded because they have been persuaded by their own reasoning process, which is visible, which has joints, which can be taken apart. The unexplained decision reveals nothing, and what reveals nothing cannot be challenged. There is a behavioral phenomenon that social psychologists call the pratfall in reverse, distinct from the classical pratfall effect, which shows that imperfection humanizes. In high-stakes authority dynamics, the opposite operates. The more a leader reveals of their internal process, the more ordinary they appear, and the more ordinary they appear, and the more ordinary they appear, the more their authority feels like a function of circumstance rather than capacity. Machiavelli watched this play out in every court he ever studied. The prince who called councils, who deliberated publicly, who showed his reasoning to his advisers, who, in other words, led transparently in the way that modern management theory celebrates, was consistently more vulnerable than the prince who decided quietly and announced completely. Not because the council was wrong to consult, because the consultation, performed visibly, transferred power to the room, and the room, given power, used it. The king who explains, gives the court something to govern him with. The king who does not keeps that instrument for himself. Here is the question underneath all of this. If explanation costs what this video says it costs, if it transfers authority, opens decisions to contest, reveals the decision-maker as someone who needs acceptance, then why do intelligent, intelligent, capable, otherwise self-aware people do it so consistently, not occasionally, reflexively, as a first response to any friction, any question, any sense that someone in the room might not be satisfied with what they've decided? The answer is not habit, though habit is part of it. The answer is not social conditioning, though. Social conditioning built the habit. The answer lives somewhere more specific and more uncomfortable than either of those. It lives in the need to be seen as reasonable. There is a specific kind of person, and it is the kind of person most likely to be watching this video, which is to say, someone thoughtful, someone who takes their own psychology seriously, someone who cares about how they move through the world, for whom being seen as reasonable is not merely a preference. It is something closer to a structural requirement, a condition of their self-concept. To be reasonable means to be the kind of person whose decisions can be defended on their merits, whose choices reflect thought rather than impulse, whose authority, such as it is earned through the quality of their judgment rather than the force of their position. This is a genuinely admirable orientation. It produces good decisions. It produces the capacity for genuine collaboration. It also produces the compulsion to explain, because if your legitimacy rests on the quality of your reasoning, then every decision you make without showing the reasoning is a decision that feels illegitimate. To you, not to them, to you. The explanation is not primarily for the other person. The explanation is for your own need to be the kind of person who explains. Machiavelli would call this a confusion of self-concept with strategy. The king does not define himself by the visibility of his reasoning. He defines himself by the outcome. The decision is the evidence. The result is the argument. The explanation is unnecessary because what he has done speaks, and what speaks does not require translation. But here is what makes this genuinely difficult. Rather than simply a matter of deciding to explain less, the need to be seen as reasonable is not vanity. It is not weakness in the ordinary sense. It is the internalization of a value system, one that prizes intellectual honesty, that distrusts authority exercised without justification, that believes, correctly, that unexplained power is often abusive power. The problem is the context collapse. What is true in one context, that authority should be accountable, that reasoning should be transparent, that the people affected by decisions deserve to understand them, is not true in all contexts. and applying the ethics of accountability to every social dynamic, including the ones where what's actually being negotiated is not fairness, but influence, means bringing a set of values to a game that is being played by different rules. Machiavelli was not saying that transparency is wrong. He was saying that it is a choice, and that most people make it without knowing they are making it. The king chooses silence, the rest explain, and the room always knows the difference. There is something that transfers when a person stops explaining. Not arrogance, not coldness, not the performance of superiority that most people fear they'll project if they simply act without justifying the action. Something quieter than all of those. Something that the people around them feel before they can name it. The sense that this person knows something, not what they know, not the content of it, the fact of it. The settled quality of someone who has arrived at a position that is not waiting for the room's response to become real, who decided, and the decision is complete, and what comes next is not discussion, but consequence. This is what Machiavelli called authority in its functional sense, not the title, not the position, the quality of presence that makes a room reorganize itself around a person without being asked. That makes people lean slightly forward, pay slightly more attention, defer slightly more readily, not because they've been commanded to, but because something in the way the person holds themselves communicates that this is appropriate. You do not build this by explaining better. You build it by explaining less, specifically by locating with precision the decisions that are yours to make, that have been thought through, that rest on something solid, and then making them without the apology, without the pre-justification, without the anxious monitoring of the room's response that signals, more clearly than any words could, that you are not yet certain you were right. Certainty is not arrogance. Certainty is the willingness to let the decision be the argument. To let time and outcome make the case that explanation would have made prematurely, partially, and at the cost of something you needed to keep. Machiavelli's gift is not a license for cruelty, or opacity, or the abuse of unaccountable power. His gift is the precise and uncomfortable observation that most people give away authority, constantly, reflexively, in small denominations they never count, and that what they're giving it away for is the temporary relief of feeling understood. Kings do not need to feel understood. They need to be effective. The question this leaves you with, the one that has no comfortable answer, and was never meant to, is which one you have been optimizing for, and whether those two things, in your life, have ever actually been the same.